What is up, guys? It is Jimmy here reminding you to smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for updates. Please do me a huge favor and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, as that really boosts the video in the algorithm. It was a hot afternoon late in the summer of 1984 when some teens cruising down Rhode Island's narrow river stumbled onto something terrible. Bobbing in the current was a flowery sleeping bag, tied up tight with rope and held under the surface by a heavy concrete block. Once police opened it up, they identified the remains as those of 24-year-old Deborah Stone. The state medical examiner verified what looked obvious from the start, confirming that Deborah had definitely been murdered. That grim discovery on September 2nd, 1984, in the sleepy village of Narragansett, kicked off a hunt that would span decades. Detectives were desperate to uncover the real story behind the tragic end of Deborah Stone. Before her remains were pulled from the water, Deborah had just completely dropped off the map. The last confirmed sighting of the young lady was on the evening of August 28th, 1984, heading to see a contact. She was meeting up with Robert Jeremiah, a 32-year-old guy living over in Johnston, Rhode Island. Witnesses and Jeremiah himself said Deborah showed up looking to trade a hot watch for a fix. Jeremiah, a known player in the drug trade with whispered ties to the mafia, insisted he was fresh out of product that evening. He told detectives later that he drove Deborah back to her place in Cranston and swore she was perfectly fine when he dropped her off. To make things confusing, a couple of folks actually claimed they spotted Deborah on August 30th, 2 full days after that meeting. These reports really messed up the timeline and gave Jeremiah a decent-looking alibi right at the start of the inquiry. When cops grilled him after finding Deborah, Jeremiah did not budge from his story and suggested a different reason for her passing. He argued that Deborah likely just took too much and overdosed, but that theory disintegrated pretty fast. The official autopsy revealed obvious injuries to her throat, which made it impossible for this to be an overdose. The evidence made it clear that strangulation was actually the cause of death. Basically, someone had choked the life out of her, proving this was a cold-blooded killing and not some accidental tragedy. Since Jeremiah was the last guy known to be with her, police started zeroing in on him regardless of his excuses. Right from the jump, the Narragansett PD had plenty of cause to look at Robert as their #1 suspect. What happened after that is either a massive failure of police work or potentially something way darker. Several people backed up the fact that Deborah was definitely hanging out with Jeremiah the night she vanished. Police found out she took a cab to his apartment and was carrying that stolen watch just like the story went. That information lined up perfectly with parts of the statement he gave about that night. Since a few people thought they saw her later and parts of his alibi worked, cops waited before tagging him as the killer. Looking back, that delay was a huge mistake, and it was not long before some serious evidence popped up. In January of 1986, roughly 18 months after the murder, a snitch walked in with a heavy admission. He admitted to detectives that he was hanging out at Jeremiah's crib on August 29, 1984. That date coincided with Deborah's murder, stretching into the early morning hours of August 30th. This witness claimed he saw Deborah's dead body inside the apartment and actually helped Jeremiah toss her into the river. He spilled very specific facts about the crime scene that were never on the news, making his story sound legit. The source said Jeremiah told him he had to take Deborah out because she was ripping him off. Even with that inside scoop and his admitted role, the case ran into a maddening brick wall. As believable as his story was, the guy's trustworthiness took a hit when he flunked a police lie detector test. Back in the mid-1980s, cops put a massive amount of faith in what those machines said. So when the snitch did not pass the box, the investigators started doubting everything he said. Actually, the police completely cut off their main witness just because of that one failed exam. They walked away even though he offered to sit in the chair again to prove he was not lying. With their star witness thrown in the trash, the whole case against Jeremiah fell to pieces. Nobody got handcuffed, and the file on Deborah Stone's murder ended up collecting dust. Nowadays, we know polygraphs are junk science, but back then, relying on them likely destroyed this investigation. Whether that failure was just incompetence or on purpose is something I'm going to dig into right now. Deborah's case sat gathering dust for decades, effectively denied any justice. The trail went cold, and lacking any fresh leads or cooperative witnesses, the file ended up shelved among the unsolved mysteries. Robert Jeremiah, the guy everyone suspected from the start, never stood trial for killing Deborah. He went on living his life while a cloud of suspicion followed him everywhere. However, Jeremiah's clock was ticking too. He passed away in 1995 at the age of 43, either from natural causes or an overdose. Considering how young he was and his known habits, I would bet money on the overdose theory rather than natural causes. As the years stretched into decades, it looked like the real story of that August night in 1984 might stay buried forever. For 41 years, Deborah's loved ones lived in limbo with unanswered questions, the shadow of her murder haunting them daily. Only recently did Deborah Stone's narrative finally get dragged back into the public eye. In 2019, the Narragansett Police Department chose to dust off the dormant file. They were motivated by a new perspective on the physical proof and a drive to finally set the record straight. Simultaneously, the Rhode Island Attorney General fired up a special cold case unit in 2023 to tackle unsolved murders just like Deborah's. This fresh squad assembled seasoned detectives. They combined cutting-edge forensics with one specific goal: give the victims' families the answers they've been waiting for. These detectives started retracing the original probe step by painstaking step. They scoured ancient files, re-examined the physical clues, and most importantly, hunted down and spoke with witnesses from the 1980s. Over an 11-month period, the squad grilled 32 individuals tied to the event, effectively rerunning the entire investigation. Time hadn't dulled the witnesses' memories one bit. Surprisingly, everything they said today matched perfectly with their statements from decades ago, including the account from that key informant from 1986. Even after all that time, he remained ready to share what he knew. Actually, when police knocked on his door, his immediate reaction was telling them he'd been waiting for them, showing he was eager to help. His story stayed rock solid compared to what he told them back in the 80s, proving he'd been telling the truth the whole time. The detectives realized a critical point. The only reason that Jeremiah avoided charges back in the 1980s was the police putting too much trust in a lie detector test. Once they looked past that hurdle, the mountain of evidence pointing at Jeremiah was undeniable. By the end of 2025, officials in Rhode Island were prepared to mark Deborah Stone's case as closed. Finally, Attorney General Peter Nerona announced to the public that they had determined Robert Jeremiah was the one who killed Deborah. This fresh look at the case constructed a solid timeline of the events. Deborah was strangled inside Jeremiah's place, and then he secretly moved her body and dumped it into the narrow river right after. The cold case team stated they now had plenty of proof to charge Jeremiah regarding Deborah's murder and likely secure a guilty verdict at trial. Naturally, this success tastes a bit sour since Jeremiah is dead and can't actually be punished for what he did. I have a few opinions on this whole thing because something about it just rubs me the wrong way. When you review how the cops treated Robert Jeremiah back in the mid-1980s, it's hard not to be completely baffled. You had a guy dealing drugs in plain sight, rumored to be mobbed up, and undeniably the last person to see Deborah Stone alive. But they never cuffed him, never charged him, and barely leaned on him at all. Letting him slide when the trail was hot has always sparked some very awkward questions. The cops had a snitch ready to finger both himself and Jeremiah, giving up precise, secret information about how they got rid of Deborah's remains. They had Jeremiah's changing stories, his weirdly relaxed theory that she overdosed, and an autopsy that proved that was a lie. Yet rather than pushing harder, the investigation just stalled out because of one flunked polygraph. It's worth noting that while lie detectors weren't viewed as total junk science back then like they are now, they were still pretty debated as a tool even in the 80s. You can't overlook the bigger picture here. This was a time when the mob had serious pull in certain areas of Rhode Island. Nobody has ever found concrete proof of dirty cops in Deborah's case, but the situation sure looks sketchy. A drug dealer with mob ties walks free despite being the last one, with a woman who ended up strangled and stuffed in a weighted sleeping bag. In the most charitable light, this was a massive failure of police work. In the darkest, it implies a conspiracy lurking in the shadows. Silence blanketed Mule Creek State Prison as the clock hit 2 in the morning. The setting wasn't a standard cell block, but rather one of the secluded, apartment-style suites designated for family visitation. A 54-year-old prisoner named David Brinson got on the line with guards to declare a medical crisis. According to him, his spouse had collapsed, prompting the facility's fire crew to rush in with CPR, yet their efforts were in vain. Less than 60 minutes later, officials declared 62-year-old Stephanie Dowles deceased, marking the beginning of a cover-up. A seemingly sad health issue was actually a homicide, and sadly, this was not an unprecedented occurrence. Actually, it had already occurred earlier that very same year, while Stephanie was there seeing her spouse, David Brinson. However, this particular convict was far from your average offender. Known as an infamous murderer, he went down in the 1990s for the execution-style slaughter of 4 men during an LA heist. Handed 4 back-to-back life sentences with 0 chance of release, the state deemed him completely beyond redemption. Despite that, officials allowed him the luxury of unsupervised, multi-day stays with his spouse in a secluded suite. Relatives of the victim were left in a state of absolute bewilderment. Nobody could grasp why a criminal with such a savage past qualified for that kind of visitation access to begin with. Probing into her demise in November of 2024 moved at a frustratingly glacial pace. Total radio silence surrounded the entire case for months on end. For a while, everyone just accepted his story that she had fainted due to some health issue. Neither the penitentiary nor the CDCR offered a single scrap of information to the press. The real story emerged thanks to the diligent efforts of the local coroner rather than any admission of guilt. 4 months post-mortem, in March 2025, the medical examiner finally released the autopsy results. Asphyxiation was the cause of death, proving definitively that Brinson had lied. District Attorney Todd Reeby had to hold off on prosecution until the facility finished its internal review. 9 months later, on August 14, 2025, prosecutors finally slapped him with an indictment. While the wait was agonizing, the family had no clue the corrections department was hiding a massive secret. She was not the only woman to lose her life in those specific visiting rooms that year. In reality, she was the second victim. Back in July 2024, 47-year-old Tanya Thomas checked in for a long weekend stay with Anthony Curry. The details surrounding her demise are a frightening mirror image of Stephanie's fate. Curry buzzed the intercom in the suite on the morning of July 1st, 2024, to alert the guards that his girlfriend was suffering a sudden medical crisis. Responders found her unresponsive, and she was declared deceased. Like Brinson, Curry was a violent lifer. Similar to the other murder, the autopsy later confirmed that she, too, had been strangled. You have 2 lifers, 2 bogus medical excuses, and 2 women dead from asphyxiation. We aren't looking at a random, standalone tragedy here. A clear trend emerged, revealing a massive, contradictory defect in the state's visitation policy. California remains one of the few places that still permits these long, overnight stays. People typically refer to these arrangements as conjugal visits. Crucially, these meetings prioritize privacy over safety, a choice now facing severe backlash. Currently, Brinson stands accused of the homicide, though he hasn't been convicted yet. What is up, guys? Jimmy here, asking you to smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. Don't forget to look into our memberships by hitting join or checking the Patreon link below. During a standard patrol on July 20th, 2019, a Lafayette County deputy found something truly disturbing. He discovered a corpse at an empty, isolated fishing spot near Sardis Lake, Mississippi. The site was way out there, roughly 30 miles from the busy grounds of Ole Miss. Authorities identified the victim by the picnic table as 21-year-old student Alexandria Costial. Authorities located her wallet and identification close by, which immediately eliminated theft as a motive. It was instantly obvious that a crime occurred. The young woman everyone called Allie had suffered numerous gunshot wounds. Detectives arriving at the site were overwhelmed by the absolute viciousness of the attack. The assailant fired no fewer than 9 rounds into her body, proving this was far from a chance encounter. Such excessive force suggested a personal vendetta fueled by intense fury, and the grim find rattled the entire town. Allie was a beloved and highly regarded figure who hailed originally from St. Louis, Missouri. The intelligent and driven senior had remained in Oxford for summer courses, pursuing a marketing degree to launch a fashion career. She held leadership roles across the university, from instructing Pilates and yoga to establishing the student golf organization. Detectives rushed to her residence, scouring the place for evidence that might shed light on her movements before she died. The team encountered a sudden obstacle because her mobile device was nowhere to be found. The killer obviously intended to sever any digital link and wipe out the history of their last conversations. However, the murderer committed a fatal technical error. While rushing to dispose of the handset, he overlooked a key detail. Resting right there on her nightstand, officers discovered Allie's smartwatch. Although the phone had vanished, the latest text had uploaded to the wearable device, making it the most crucial witness for the state. The gadget gave police a virtual blueprint of her daily struggles and fears while pointing directly toward a solid prime suspect. Her final correspondence had been with a 22-year-old classmate by the name of Brandon Thiesfeld. Yet the device offered more than just an identity. It also revealed the reason behind the crime. Those archived messages contained information that detectives described as altering the course of one's entire future. Allie had spent the prior 3 months discussing a frightening scenario with Thiesfeld, fearing she was expecting a child. Thanks to that small, synchronized piece of technology, the investigation never stalled as a mystery. Mere hours after discovering the remains, authorities identified their man and the so-called issue he was frantic to fix. The pair originally crossed paths in 2016, but their dynamic was notoriously difficult to define. Peers characterized the bond as sporadic and casual, noting they never actually put a label on it. She was heavily invested while he remained distant, a dynamic that baffled her circle since he frequently sent cruel messages and treated her like dirt. His public standing at the university aligned perfectly with his conduct behind closed doors. One student who lived near him bluntly characterized the young man as exceptionally conceited. He perpetually boasted about his family wealth and claimed his father could fix any trouble he got into. That is the individual she confided in during April 2019, upon suspecting she was carrying a baby. She messaged him about her worries and shared a picture of a confusing test result, only to receive an instantly icy response. He replied that fatherhood would destroy his existence, and he was unprepared. While Allie spent the following quarter trying to handle things rationally. She attempted to schedule a sit-down to figure out a plan, but Thiesfeld flatly declined. He kept dodging her and bailing on arrangements, maintaining control by keeping their interactions strictly virtual. He could ghost her without consequence, and her frantic need for a real conversation eventually became her fatal weakness. Prosecutors later contended that he viewed the circumstances as far more than a mere sticky situation. The issue was not limited to the possible baby. The problem was the woman herself. She represented an obstacle that endangered his ability to live without repercussions. The saddest part is that his reason for killing was grounded in paranoia rather than truth, a terrible irony later verified by both the medical examiner and his own lawyer. The young woman had not actually been expecting a child at any time. Following her messages in April, his browser history revealed attempts to find methods for secretly terminating a pregnancy, as he sought an easy fix. However, once July rolled around, his objective evolved from stopping a birth to destroying a human being. She messaged him once more on July 12th, sending images of 2 additional unclear test results. That moment seemed to snap something inside him, because he immediately drove from Mississippi back to his family residence near Dallas. He came back carrying a handgun his dad bought, and his online activity turned incredibly dark. He stopped searching for medication and started looking up specific bullets and noise suppressors. The most chilling part was his deep dive into Ted Bundy, specifically focusing on how the serial killer tricked his prey. Honestly, this detail might seem minor, but it perfectly highlights just how conceited and incompetent this guy really was. He actually went online and typed into a search bar, asking which lever performed which function on a standard Glock pistol. Despite nurturing these twisted delusions, he lacked even the most basic knowledge of how to operate his chosen firearm. He initiated his scheme on the evening of July 19, 2019, starting just like any ordinary night for Ally. State attorneys argued he modeled his approach after serial killer Ted Bundy, planning to lower her defenses using charisma. Around 7 in the evening, she shared a cheerful conversation over the phone with her mom, Cindy. They had recently finished fixing up her living space for the new semester, and Allie was buzzing with anticipation. She mentioned waking up from a quick rest and intended to hit the town with her crew, which security cameras later verified. At 11:52 at night, video feeds recorded Allie walking out of a local watering hole known as Funky's on Oxford Square. She was completely fine, and 5 minutes later at 11:57, clips show her hopping into a rideshare vehicle by herself. The driver dropped her off at her place right near 12 o'clock, but shortly after entering her door, the snare was set. Her phone lit up with the specific notification she had spent 90 days hoping for. Brandon Thiesfeld was ready to see her. Near 1:28 in the morning, digital logs and camera recordings placed Thiesfeld's pickup arriving outside her residence. Thinking this was her chance to finally have that crucial in-person talk, Allie climbed into the passenger seat on her own accord. However, Brandon claimed the conversation was too heavy for a simple parking spot chat and proposed they go for a ride instead. Tragically, she still had faith in him, so she agreed to leave the safety of her home. He steered the vehicle about a half hour out from the university, heading toward a desolate fishing outpost at Sardis Lake he had chosen earlier. Cellular signals from both of their devices registered at that isolated spot right when the crime occurred. At that site, he pulled the trigger and discarded her remains, which a patrolling officer discovered only a few hours afterward. The entire scheme fell apart nearly instantly because of the data tracked by her smartwatch. When detectives reached out to interview him, he stalled with various pretexts, swearing he would show up Monday with zero intent to do so. When Monday, July 22nd rolled around, he was nowhere to be found at the station. Officers, having already secured the necessary legal warrants, pinged his mobile device and realized he was on the run. GPS coordinates placed him heading northbound into Memphis, Tennessee, prompting officials to broadcast a lookout for his vehicle. Spotting the rig was simple given the cocky, personalized license plate attached to the bumper that spelled out the phrase, "Take it." They apprehended him peacefully at a fuel stop in Memphis, while dashboard cameras recorded the finale. Naturally, his bravado vanished when facing badges. Perhaps he just wanted to stay alive, but regardless, the incriminating items found in his possession were damning. He was actually still wearing apparel stained with visible biological matter. In the cab, troopers recovered his father's firearm, ballistically linking it to the spent cartridges at the lake, locking down the case except for one detail. A search of his living quarters revealed a handwritten note addressed to his mother and father from that same weekend. The state viewed it as an admission of guilt, where he described having persistent dark impulses, which he attributed to using intoxicants. He expressed regret for his behavior and acknowledged his fate was likely death while fleeing or permanent incarceration. It was a forecast that might have seemed profound if the outcome hadn't been so clearly inevitable. By August of 2019, a grand jury formally charged Brandon Thiesfeld with capital murder. The severity of the accusation hinged on the claim that he abducted Allie by tricking her into visiting the reservoir. With execution on the table and mountains of proof against him, he still entered an initial plea of innocence. Following major postponements caused by the global events of 2020, the legal proceedings reached a practical resolution. To avoid the lethal injection, he accepted a life sentence that offers a slight possibility of conditional freedom once he turns 65. In my opinion, wasting your prime years behind bars only to be dumped back into society as a senior citizen feels like a far crueler fate. Standing before the judge, Thiesfeld finally cracked and wept during the hearing after displaying zero feelings for 2 straight years. He proceeded to read a prepared apology addressed directly to Allie's grieving relatives. He claimed to feel genuine remorse for the devastation he inflicted, admitting that his behavior was completely inexcusable. The prosecution team delivered a powerful impact statement on behalf of Allie's kin in response to his words. Her mom, Cindy, authored a letter explaining how her daughter's absence had completely destroyed their world. In a distinct statement, Thiesfeld's mother expressed deep turmoil over the fact that her son never revealed his internal struggles to them. She encouraged moms and dads to discuss hidden skeletons with their kids, but considering Thiesfeld's character, that advice seems a bit off base to me. His folks evidently reared a classic spoiled brat who expected the world to be served to him on a silver platter. The warning here runs a whole lot deeper than just sitting down for a quick chat every once in a while.